Across the quiet hills and rolling forests of America, towns were rising almost overnight. Streets laid down with military precision. Homes stacked tightly together to shelter thousands. Factories spewing the engines of war. And yet, few Americans even knew these towns existed. They were built in secrecy, born from necessity, and designed for one purpose: to win a war half a world away. The outbreak of World War II transformed the United States almost overnight. From a nation still recovering from the Great Depression, America was suddenly thrust into the role of the arsenal of democracy. Factories had to churn out tanks, planes, ammunition, and ships at a speed no one had ever seen. But where would the thousands of workers live? Where would they eat, sleep, and raise their children? The solution was radical. Entire towns built from scratch in weeks in remote areas hidden from prying eyes. In 1940, before the United States had even entered the war, the government foresaw a looming challenge. The nation's existing cities and industrial centers were already strained. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia were producing vehicles and weapons, but they could not handle the explosion of wartime production alone. The solution was the creation of emergency war towns, planned communities designed to house workers, scientists, and military personnel. One of the most famous examples was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Hidden in the Tennessee Valley, surrounded by dense forests and hills, Oak Ridge would become a hub of the Manhattan Project, the secret U.S. nuclear weapons program. The town's population skyrocketed from a few hundred to tens of thousands in a matter of months. Entire neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and shopping areas were built to accommodate them. Streets were laid out with military precision, buildings were coded instead of named, and no map showed the town. To outsiders, it was as if Oak Ridge simply did not exist. But Oak Ridge was only the beginning. Across the country, smaller towns were rising around munitions plants, shipyards, and aircraft factories. Some towns grew near rivers to facilitate transportation, others near railways or isolated deserts for secrecy. The government coordinated with industrial giants like Ford, DuPont, and General Electric, commissioning them to build massive facilities, and alongside them, entire living communities for workers. Life in these towns was regimented. Housing was basic but efficient: row houses, small apartment complexes, and communal dormitories for single workers. Streets and neighborhoods were planned for efficiency rather than beauty. Schools opened to serve the children of workers, and hospitals were constructed quickly to handle both normal and wartime emergencies. Despite the speed of construction, there was an emphasis on morale and community. Recreation halls, movie theaters, and cafeterias were built. Sporting events and community gatherings became crucial outlets for the workers and their families. Yet there was always an undercurrent of secrecy. Workers signed oaths not to speak of their projects. Visitors were rare, carefully vetted, and monitored. Photographs were strictly forbidden in many areas, especially around Oak Ridge and other classified sites. The war effort also transformed American society. With so many men deployed overseas, women filled roles traditionally held by men. Factories were staffed by thousands of women, famously symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. These women operated machinery, assembled bombs, and even trained to handle technical equipment previously reserved for male workers. Minority populations, too, played a crucial role. African Americans migrated from the South to work in factories in the North and Midwest, often encountering challenges of segregation and discrimination, even as they contributed to a national effort. Their labor was essential in keeping the wheels of war moving. The sudden growth of these towns created a unique social experiment. Communities built in months, held together by shared secrecy and urgency. Yet, for all the bustle of life, there was always a looming question: what would happen to these towns after the war? Secrecy was paramount. Some towns were labeled restricted areas. Access was limited to residents and essential personnel. Guards patrolled entrances, and fences or natural barriers concealed the town from aerial observation. Maps omitted these areas entirely, and addresses were often coded. Communication with the outside world was limited. Letters were censored, phone lines monitored, and residents instructed not to discuss their work. In Oak Ridge, for instance, workers often did not know what they were producing, only that it was critical to the war effort. Families adapted to this culture of secrecy, living with curiosity and sometimes fear of the unknown. The towns weren't just living spaces, they were war machines. Factories operated 24 hours a day, producing planes, tanks, and ammunition at unprecedented speed. Workers endured long shifts and strict schedules. The U.S. government coordinated logistics, housing, and social services to ensure maximum efficiency. By the end of 1944, the network of war towns spanned the country. Some, like Willow Run, Michigan, were dedicated to aircraft production. Willow Run alone produced thousands of B-24 bombers, a staggering feat that would not have been possible without the supporting town infrastructure for workers. But speed came at a cost. Many towns were built with temporary materials. Homes were small, schools and hospitals sometimes lacked resources, and social structures were strained under rapid growth. Yet, workers accepted these hardships, united by purpose. Letters and diaries from the era reveal pride in contributing to victory, despite the austere living conditions. Visual cue: show archival photos of Oak Ridge streets under construction, families moving in, and factory interiors bustling with activity. Overlay maps showing secret town locations across the U.S. Some towns were not built for secrecy, they were built for production. Gigantic factories rose from fields and forests, and around them entire communities formed. Streets hummed with life. Cafeterias fed thousands. Schools echoed with children's laughter. And yet, like a candle burning at both ends, these towns existed for one purpose: to win the war. And when the war ended, many of them flickered out, leaving only shadows and ruins behind. During World War II, the United States faced a logistical and industrial challenge unlike anything in its history. Factories had to be built, machines had to be operated, and workers had to be housed, sometimes in the middle of nowhere. To solve this, the government and private companies worked together to construct massive industrial complexes accompanied by towns to support the workforce. These towns were efficient, functional, and designed to grow rapidly, but few were intended to last. Across the country, factory towns sprang up around critical production sites. The logic was simple: house workers close to the factory to maximize output and minimize commuting time. Some of these towns grew into tens of thousands of residents almost overnight. Willow Run, Michigan. Perhaps the most famous, Willow Run was built by Ford to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. By 1944, it churned out one bomber every 63 minutes. Surrounding the massive assembly plant were dormitories, schools, and social centers for the tens of thousands of workers who moved there. Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant, Kansas. Located in a sparsely populated area, the town around the plant grew to support workers producing munitions for the war effort. Communities sprang up around temporary housing and cafeteria-style mess halls. Naval Ordnance Plant, Indiana. This facility produced weapons for the Navy and required a sizable workforce, which meant building a full town with housing, schools, and hospitals. These towns were built with a single-minded focus: function over form. Houses were small, often identical, and designed for rapid assembly. Streets were laid out to maximize accessibility, not aesthetics. Community centers, theaters, and recreational halls were included to maintain morale, but the primary purpose of the town was to keep factories running at full speed. Daily life in these towns was regimented. Workers often labored 10-12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Cafeterias operated around the clock to feed them. Schools and childcare facilities allowed families to maintain some semblance of normal life, but everything revolved around production schedules. Women formed a vital part of the workforce. At Willow Run, thousands of women, many from Detroit and nearby cities, learned to operate machinery, assemble aircraft components, and handle complex logistics. Minority workers, including African Americans migrating from the South, faced discrimination, but were essential to maintaining the pace of production. The towns themselves were bustling, but there was an ever-present tension. Many towns were built quickly, with temporary materials like plywood and tar paper. Housing was basic. Water and electricity were often rationed. And yet, letters from the time reveal pride and determination. Workers understood that every plane, shell, or tank produced brought the Allies closer to victory. The design of factory towns reflected the urgency of the era. Streets were straight and wide, factories large and mechanized, housing uniform and functional. Many towns included temporary schools and hospitals, constructed with the assumption that they might only be needed for a few years. Community spaces were strategically placed to maintain morale. Recreational centers offered movies, dances, and sporting events. Cafeterias served as social hubs where workers could gather after grueling shifts. Despite these efforts, life in these towns was exhausting. Workers had little privacy, long hours, and constant pressure to meet production quotas. Yet the shared experience created tight-knit communities. Children grew up knowing that their parents' work was crucial to the war effort. Friendships formed rapidly in dormitories and shared housing. And for many, this intense, purposeful life was a source of pride. Then, in 1945, the war ended. Factories that had operated 24/7 suddenly slowed, and towns built for war production faced an existential question. What comes next? Many towns experienced rapid population decline. Workers returned to their hometowns, leaving behind empty streets and shuttered schools. Temporary housing fell into disrepair. Community centers, once filled with laughter and conversation, became silent. Factories either closed or were repurposed for peacetime production, but often at a fraction of their former scale. Some towns were completely abandoned. Buildings decayed, streets cracked, and nature began reclaiming the land. Ghost towns emerged across the country, silent monuments to a time when America mobilized every resource for global war. In Sunflower, Kansas, families left quickly after the plant slowed production. Today, the remnants of streets and empty foundations are all that remain. Willow Run transitioned into a peacetime factory, but large sections of worker housing were demolished, leaving only patches of former streets and sidewalks. In Indiana, the naval ordnance plants surrounding town vanished almost entirely after the war, with only a few buildings and roads marking its former presence. These towns, once vibrant with thousands of residents, became eerily silent almost overnight. Photographers visiting decades later found streets overtaken by grass, empty factories slowly rusting, and homes with windows staring blankly into the sky. Though abandoned, these towns left a lasting impact. They demonstrated America's ability to mobilize industrial resources at unprecedented speed. They accelerated technological development, expanded the workforce to include women and minorities, and created temporary communities that supported the nation's war effort. For historians and urban explorers today, the remains of these towns tell a story of human resilience and ingenuity, as well as the impermanence of places built for a single, urgent purpose. The factories that built victory also built towns that were never meant to last, and in their ruins, we see the echoes of thousands of lives devoted to a single goal: victory at any cost. Visual cue: archival footage of factories at full operation, aerial shots of abandoned towns, empty streets overtaken by vegetation, and black and white photos of workers on assembly lines. Hidden behind forests, hills, and fences, these towns didn't appear on any public map. Streets were lined with houses identical in design, their residents sworn to secrecy. Factories and laboratories hummed with unseen purpose, guarded day and night. For those who lived there, life was normal and extraordinary all at once, because no one could speak of what they were building. These were America's secret cities of the Manhattan Project. By 1942, the United States had committed to a race unlike any other in history, the creation of the atomic bomb. The stakes were enormous. Victory in Europe and the Pacific could hinge on scientific innovation, and the nation needed people, infrastructure, and secrecy in equal measure. This demand gave birth to towns that existed purely for research, engineering, and experimentation. Oak Ridge is perhaps the most famous example of a Manhattan Project town. Before the war, it was farmland and forest. Overnight, it became a hub of scientific ingenuity, population, and secrecy. Population explosion. From a few hundred residents, Oak Ridge swelled to over 75,000 by 1945. Scientists, engineers, construction workers, and their families poured into hastily built neighborhoods. Living in secrecy, workers were assigned housing without knowing their neighbors' work. Addresses were coded, and security checkpoints were everywhere. Cameras and letters were restricted, and guards patrolled the perimeter. Residents were aware that something extraordinary was happening, but few knew the exact nature of their work. Factories and laboratories. Oak Ridge housed uranium enrichment plants that were essential to the bomb. Massive facilities hummed with machinery designed to separate isotopes, operations so complex that only a select few understood the science behind them. Daily life. Schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities were constructed rapidly. Families attempted normalcy amid extraordinary circumstances. Children attended classes while the world outside was at war, unaware of the monumental task their parents were performing. Visual cue. Archival photos show rows of identical houses, children playing in Oak Ridge streets, and workers walking past enormous enrichment facilities. Meanwhile, in the remote deserts of New Mexico, Los Alamos became the epicenter of atomic research. Unlike Oak Ridge, which was a sprawling town supporting thousands of laborers, Los Alamos was primarily a scientific community. Security and isolation. Surrounded by mountains and barbed wire, Los Alamos was effectively a fortress. Entry was highly restricted, and residents needed clearance just to cross the town. Scientific collaboration. Some of the greatest minds of the 20th century converged here. Physicists, chemists, and engineers worked around the clock, often living in dormitories or shared housing. Their mission: design a weapon powerful enough to end the war. Challenges of life in isolation. Daily life was rigorous. Food was rationed, recreation limited, and families often separated. Scientists lived with constant stress and secrecy, aware that their work could change history. The human element. Despite the pressure, a sense of community developed. Children were schooled in makeshift classrooms, clubs and sports teams were formed, and neighbors shared stories, but always carefully, knowing the stakes of a misplaced word. Visual cue. Black and white footage of Los Alamos buildings, scientists at blackboards, and children playing in improvised playgrounds. Beyond Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, several smaller towns and facilities were built to support the war effort. Hanford, Washington, a massive facility for plutonium production. Like Oak Ridge, Hanford housed tens of thousands of workers and their families in temporary towns. Guard towers, fences, and strict security kept the operation secret. Tennessee Valley Authority towns. Supporting infrastructure, electricity, and water were constructed in remote locations to power research facilities. These towns were lifelines of the atomic project. Without housing, transportation, and daily services, scientists and workers could not focus on the monumental tasks before them. Yet, all these communities existed in constant tension between ordinary life and extraordinary secrecy. Living in a Manhattan Project town meant that silence was as important as work. Residents were instructed never to speak of their jobs outside the workplace. Letters were censored. Mail and packages were monitored. Guards patrolled streets and visitors were rare. Even among family members, few details could be shared. This secrecy created unique social dynamics. Neighbors worked side by side, yet knew very little about each other. Friendships were cautious, and children learned early that the world outside the town was dangerous in ways they could not understand. Despite the secrecy, residents built lives. Community centers, sports events, and schools provided normalcy. Women managed households and childcare while contributing to war work. Children learned to live in a world of hidden knowledge. Stories from diaries and letters describe quiet pride, frustration, and determination. Workers and scientists often faced long hours, high stress, and isolation. Yet there was also camaraderie. Residents shared meals, celebrated small victories, and supported one another through the intense pressure of wartime work. Visual cue: footage of community gatherings, classrooms, and families inside Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford. When the war ended in 1945, these towns faced dramatic changes. Oak Ridge transitioned into a permanent research center, Los Alamos became a hub for post-war scientific research, and Hanford's temporary housing was largely abandoned. Some structures were demolished, others remained, slowly decaying as decades passed. The human footprint faded, leaving ghostly streets, empty dormitories, and silent factories. Yet these towns remain as enduring symbols of human ingenuity, determination, and the extraordinary lengths America went to win a global war. In the secret cities of the Manhattan Project, everyday life and extraordinary science coexisted. Families shopped for groceries beside reactors, children played near laboratories, and workers labored on inventions that would change the world forever. And when the war ended, these towns left behind echoes of a hidden chapter in America's history, ghost towns of knowledge and ambition. Towns rise, towns fall, but people remain, or at least they leave echoes behind. Streets that once buzzed with life become silent. Schools stand empty. Cafeterias are deserted. And yet, the memories of those who lived there linger in letters, diaries, and the faint whispers of stories passed down through generations. These are the stories of the people left behind. When America built towns for war, whether for industry, science, or military training, it was not just concrete and steel that was mobilized. Thousands of families, workers, and children uprooted their lives to inhabit these rapidly constructed communities. They carried with them hopes, fears, and a willingness to endure hardship for the war effort. Life in a wartime town was both extraordinary and ordinary. Streets bustled with children, neighbors formed friendships quickly, and community centers offered dances, movies, and sports. Yet, everything existed under the shadow of war. Work and housing. Most adults worked long hours. In industrial towns like Willow Run or Sunflower, shifts often lasted 10–12 hours. Housing was functional but cramped. Families lived in identical row houses or temporary dormitories. Privacy was limited, but neighbors relied on one another for support. Education and play. Schools were established quickly, often in temporary buildings or converted spaces. Children played in streets, parks, and schoolyards while learning the importance of their families, contributions to the war. Stories from diaries describe kids collecting scrap metal for drives or participating in victory gardens alongside adults. Women and minorities. Women took on industrial and clerical work, supporting the war effort while managing households. African Americans and other minorities often faced segregation and discrimination, but were integral to the workforce. Their labor kept factories running, laboratories operational, and the towns alive. Visual cue. Photos of children playing in Oak Ridge, women operating machinery at Willow Run, and diverse communities walking through bustling town streets. The most vivid window into life in these towns comes from personal records. Diaries of factory workers in Michigan describe exhaustion, camaraderie, and pride. I wake before dawn and head to the plant. The assembly line is relentless, but I know each plane we build could save lives overseas. My husband checks on the children before heading to his shift. We eat quickly, sleep briefly, and do it all again tomorrow. It is exhausting but necessary. Letters from children living in Oak Ridge reveal the curious duality of secrecy and normal life. Mom says we mustn't talk about her work. I don't know what she does exactly, but she seems important. The town is growing every day. New houses, new schools, new faces. It feels like we live in a different world, one everyone else can't see. These records show how residents navigated the tension between routine life and extraordinary circumstances, balancing family, work, and national duty. While many thrived, the rapid pace of life and secrecy carried a human cost. Stress and isolation, long hours, constant supervision, and the pressure to maintain secrecy created psychological strain. Workers worried about mistakes, accidents, or breaching security protocols. Families experienced emotional strain as parents disappeared for shifts, and children learned early to live with uncertainty. Displacement and migration. Many towns were built in remote areas. Workers and families had often moved from other states, leaving behind support networks. Social ties had to be rebuilt quickly, creating a transient sense of community. Health and safety. Rapid construction and overpopulation sometimes compromised sanitation, safety, and medical care. Hospitals worked tirelessly to keep up with accidents, illness, and childbirth in towns that had grown overnight. Visual cue. Archival footage of workers entering factories, nurses tending to patients, and children playing near temporary homes. Despite hardships, these communities formed bonds that endured long after the war. Workers organized social events, sports leagues, and holiday celebrations. Neighbors helped each other with childcare and household needs. In letters and memoirs, former residents recall, "We were strangers brought together by necessity, but we became a family. The war forced us into this strange, hurried life, but it also taught us the strength of community." Even as factories hummed and secret laboratories operated, ordinary life continued. School plays, picnics, birthday parties, and church gatherings all existed alongside atomic research and aircraft production. Then in 1945, the war ended. Factories slowed, research facilities completed their projects, and military training programs shut down. For families and workers, life changed abruptly. Eviction and relocation. Many wartime houses were temporary, designed to be dismantled after the war. Families had to find new homes, often returning to cities or towns they had left behind years before. Loss of community. Friendships and support networks formed under pressure dissolved as people dispersed. Streets that once echoed with laughter became quiet, leaving behind homes and buildings with no one inside. Abandoned schools and cafeterias. Facilities that had served thousands became empty almost overnight. Recreational centers, libraries, and playgrounds were left to decay, along with the stories of those who had lived there. Visual cue. Footage of abandoned streets, empty classrooms, overgrown playgrounds, and crumbling cafeterias. Even as the physical structures disappeared, the memories of these communities endured. Former residents recounted stories to their children and grandchildren, preserving a sense of pride and sacrifice. Reunion events and historical societies now attempt to document these forgotten towns, compiling letters, photographs, and oral histories to ensure the stories survive. Oral histories. Residents describe the unique feeling of living in a town that existed purely for war, a mix of purpose, secrecy, and urgency. Lessons learned. These stories remind us that even temporary communities can leave lasting cultural and emotional legacies. The streets may be empty, the houses abandoned, and the factories silent, but the lives lived there echo through history. The people of these towns built more than bombs and planes. They built communities in impossible circumstances, and their stories remain long after the last light in the windows went out. Step into a street where no one walks. Listen closely to an empty cafeteria, once alive with the chatter of workers and children. These are America's ghost towns of World War II, silent witnesses to a war that reshaped a nation. The buildings stand, the streets remain, but the life that once defined them has vanished. And yet, in decay, there is a story waiting to be told. By the late 1940s and 1950s, many wartime towns faced a stark reality. The factories slowed or closed, military projects ended, and temporary housing was no longer needed. Streets that had once teemed with families, workers, and children became silent and overgrown. Buildings built for urgency rather than longevity began to crumble. Abandoned factories and streets. Willow Run, Michigan. Once the hum of thousands of workers filled the air as B-24 bombers rolled off assembly lines. Post-war, much of the town's housing was removed. The factories remained, but vast sections of streets and worker dormitories were left to the elements. Concrete cracked, windows shattered, and nature slowly reclaimed the land. Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant. Kansas. After production slowed, entire neighborhoods of workers were abandoned. Empty streets, silent playgrounds, and shuttered schools became the new reality. Today, only remnants of foundations, empty mess halls, and overgrown streets remain. Naval Ordnance Plant, Indiana. The town built around this facility disappeared almost entirely. Once a bustling hub for thousands, decades later, only rusting factories and cracked roads mark its existence. The physical decay of these towns is a silent narrative of wartime urgency, post-war change, and the impermanence of communities built for a single purpose. One of the most striking aspects of abandoned towns is how nature overtakes them. Streets become rivers of grass, sidewalks cracked by roots. Buildings collapse under weather. Rust consumes metal factories, and forests creep into former neighborhoods. Animals return, filling empty streets and playgrounds with life absent for decades. For photographers and urban explorers, these ghost towns offer a haunting beauty. Crumbling structures telling the story of ambition, sacrifice, and impermanence. Visual cue: drone footage slowly gliding over overgrown streets, rusted factories, and collapsing homes. Soft wind blowing through abandoned buildings. Haunting remnants of life. Schools, chalkboards still in classrooms, abandoned playgrounds, and overgrown fields evoke echoes of children who once played there. Dormitories and homes. Tiny rooms that once housed families now stand empty, with peeling paint, broken windows, and furniture long gone. Factories and labs. Gigantic machines remain silent, rusting in place. Assembly lines frozen in time serve as monuments to human effort and technological ambition. Each abandoned object, each cracked street, tells a story of urgency, purpose, and eventual abandonment. Some towns were partially repurposed after the war. Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford transitioned into research centers or government facilities. Others, like Willow Run and Sunflower, partially resumed civilian life. But most of the smaller industrial and training towns disappeared, leaving few traces of the communities that once thrived. Former residents often return years later, finding familiar streets unrecognizable. Oral histories preserve the human stories that buildings alone cannot tell. Photographers, historians, and urban explorers document these sites, ensuring the stories of abandoned towns remain alive. Visual cue: split-screen archival photos versus modern abandoned ruins to show the passage of time. These ghost towns are more than abandoned buildings. They symbolize the human, industrial, and social cost of war. Human achievement. They demonstrate America's unparalleled ability to mobilize resources, workforce, and technology rapidly. Impermanence. They remind us that even monumental efforts are temporary, and communities built for a singular purpose may vanish when that purpose ends. Memory and history. Ghost towns preserve memories of sacrifice, ingenuity, and resilience. They allow us to walk through history, to see the physical manifestation of the human effort that shaped the modern world. Walking through these streets today, one can hear the echoes of a world at war, the laughter of children, the hum of factories, the quiet conversations of neighbors. These towns may be silent now, but their stories resonate, reminding us that even the most extraordinary efforts can leave behind only whispers in the wind. The war ended, the factories fell silent, and the towns emptied. Streets that once hummed with life became overgrown. Houses that sheltered families became hollow shells. And yet, these ghost towns are far from empty. They are full of memory, full of history, and full of lessons for a nation that built them in a time of extraordinary urgency. America's World War II towns, whether secret scientific cities, massive industrial hubs, or temporary military housing, demonstrate the power of human ingenuity and resilience. They remind us that when a nation mobilizes for a common goal, incredible feats are possible. Entire towns built in months, planes and bombs produced at record speed, and communities forged in secrecy and sacrifice. Yet these towns also tell another story: impermanence. No matter how vital, how busy, or how large, communities built for a singular purpose may vanish when that purpose ends. Ghost towns across the U.S. stand as monuments to both ambition and ephemerality. Lessons for today. Innovation under pressure. Communities can rise and achieve the impossible when resources, focus, and purpose align. Human stories matter. Behind every factory, lab, and street were lives, families, children, workers, whose stories must not be forgotten. Preserving history. Even abandoned, these towns are living lessons in urban planning, industrial mobilization, and wartime society. As we walk through these silent streets today, we hear echoes of determination, sacrifice, and ingenuity. They remind us that even in silence, the human story endures. America's ghost towns of World War II are more than ruins. They are monuments to a nation at war, and to the people who built, lived, and left them behind. Visual cue. Fade from aerial shots of overgrown streets and abandoned factories to archival footage of bustling wartime towns, ending on a quiet sunrise over an empty street.